Hello and welcome to today's APS webinar entitled Dynamic Metabolic Testing Insights in Elite Athletes and Tactical Performance. My name is Jake White of the American Physiological Society, and I'll be serving as your moderator today. In today's session, we will review the use of novel metabolic analysis technology in uniquely challenging human studies, such as elite athletes and warfighters. Eva Piatrikova will highlight how emerging metabolic analysis technology helps exercise physiologists translate data into strategic fitness programs, and Mark Jones will introduce the current framework for assessing and researching cardiorespiratory fitness in military settings. And before we begin, just have a few housekeeping notes. Out of respect for our speakers, we ask that you refrain from photo or video capture of the presentation in whole or in part. This session will be recorded and available for future viewing through a link on the registration website. Taking photographs of another person's presentation without their explicit permission is prohibited. At this time, all attendees except for the speaker are in listen-only mode with video off. As moderator, I'll be happy to raise any questions that you have that are entered through the Q&A function that's located at the bottom of your screen. Now, before we begin, I would also like to thank today's sponsor, VO2 Master, for their support of APS and our mission to improve human health through discovery. Today's session will end at 12 p.m. Eastern. Before we begin, we ask that you answer a brief survey regarding your experience with metabolic analysis technology and exercise studies. So the poll has been launched. Please complete it at your convenience, and we will begin in a moment. All right, thank you very much for providing your background and insights. And now I will introduce our speakers. Dr. Eva Piatrikova is a Slavic-born exercise physiologist and performance scientist who completed her doctorate in applied physiology at the University of Bath in the UK. Her doctoral work focuses on bridging the gap between scientific testing and practical training practical training prescription in swimming. Mark Edward Jones, a PhD candidate in health and human performance at Concordia University, Chicago, is a health education manager, tactical performance specialist, and exercise physiologist with extensive experience supporting military readiness across the Department of Defense. All right, now with that, I'm going to pass this off to Eva. Eva, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Jacob. Can I just check with you if you're gonna see my slides, please?
Absolutely.
Just a second. Can you see them?
Yep, they look great.
Okay, perfect. So, hi guys. So in this quick session today, I'm just gonna share some of my insights working with VO2 Master. So my main area is in exercise physiology, but I would say it's more doing applied work. I no longer engage too much in academia, and in my job, I'm trying to innovate and use metabolic testing to allow athletes to maximize their potential and fine tune their training so they can peak at the appropriate time. So my main job is working with professional swimmers and NHL players. I do some work with triathletes and like MMA fighting and water slalom. But let's go through the slides and I will just share my practices. So to start with, let me introduce almost like my framework of how I work. So obviously we have domains that underpin elite performance. And I would say that although I am a physiologist, I can see how I can utilize metabolic testing in monitoring technical changes and tactical changes. So I might share some things with you on that. And in my role, I'm obviously trying to manipulate the performance tools that are that are gonna try to, or I'm trying to help athletes with fine-tuning training, optimizing recovery. It's mainly linked to recovery between the reps and sets. Recovery, obviously, in relation to sleep. We are trying to fine-tune nutrition for the athletes and supplements that work for them. And at the same time, we obviously have to deal with mental hygiene and mental fitness of the athlete. So the whole process when working with metabolic testing starts with us with the 3P principle, where we always try to analyze performance. We try to profile the athlete against the demands of the event. And then ideally, we want to try to utilize the data to prescribe training. And in my role, I'm mainly focused on assessment of body composition, alongside the tracking of resting metabolic rate or basal metabolic rate. I check blood profiles, I look at sweat analysis and thermoregulation, and the most important part for me is the performance profile or the physiology profile. And this is where VO2 Master comes really handy for me because it allows me to track the relationship between how the lungs behave, the cardiovascular system works, and the muscles work. And at the same time, I can utilize it to check if the fuel we are giving to the athlete is working at the right level, so those cogs can keep spinning and keep spinning at the higher and higher rate. So to start with the VO2 Master, I use it mainly for ramp and step tests. It's well, like with any metabolic card, it allows me to assess oxygen consumption, the heart rate. I can connect it with parameter either through cycling pedals or straight the running parameter. But what I find really useful is you can see these athletes on the photos to be inside the gym. But what I love about VO2 Master is I can take it to really any environment and it doesn't interfere with their specific movement. So previously I was using a mobile K5 where you have a rucksack. And what I found, especially with like ultra runners or biathletes, for example, that it kind of interfered with their technique. So that's one of the highlights I see by utilizing the analyzer. What I really like is it allows me to assess how well the athlete is breathing. So here is an example of what I keep checking on. So you can see in here the respiratory frequency. What I tend to come across with, especially like water slalom athletes or MMA players or even NHL players, they don't have very efficient breathing. So what I tend to see is like it goes up and down a lot. So what it allows me to do when I have the VO2 Master, for example, within the training setup, I can see if they are expanding the lungs at the right rate. So we can assess with physiotherapists if they are actually applying the correct breathing technique. What I love too is it allows me to connect Moxie monitors we use on daily basis with elite athletes. So we can actually monitor the relationship. I find useful when explaining things to coaches and athletes, how the interaction works between the heart, the lungs, and the muscle capacity to draw oxygen and also to recover from specific training intensity or a load. Um, just to give you a few examples, my main role is to be a swimming physiologist. I work with a few Olympic champions and world champions, and there is a nice example of how I use VO2 Master. So this is a step test where we run 200 meters at increasing speed, which is something like most of the physiologists came across. But what is challenging in swimming is the fact that it's difficult to measure VO2 or oxygen uptake for swimmers. And there is something about swimming like when I used to test, we used to have a snorkel. You would have to breathe through that and you would go up and down with a swimmer. And it would really interfere with their swimming technique. And it would come to the like almost to the point where coaches wouldn't want to assess swimming physiology because if you don't apply the technique in the water you are used to, and if you don't follow the restriction of breathing that is happening in swimming, then the results are very little applicable to swimmers and swimming coaching. So there is an example from a swimmer I work with, and you can nicely see like what data I can get. So how I work with the VO2 master, the swimmer comes in, I put the VO2 master on, and through back extrapolation, I get the data related to oxygen consumption and also related to respiratory frequency, tidal volume, and minute ventilation. What I find extremely useful in swimmers is we can finally measure swimming economy. So it means how much oxygen the swimmer consumes per 100-meter pace. So what we can actually then assess is if a coach makes a technical change, uh, then we can see if it's actually working well, and they can double check themselves if that's going to translate into swimming performance. At the same time, we do work with swimming suit companies. So obviously, you guys know that there are different companies that do swimsuits, and so do they do wetsuits. So you can actually check if the swimsuit and wetsuit you buy is the most economical for you. So, for example, in triathletes, um, very often you buy wetsuits like they have different thickness of the neoprene. And what we are working on at the moment with one company is by you moving the thickness of the wetsuit, if you can lift the legs better, and if it therefore translates to lower oxygen cost, which is what you want if you are going especially for like longer distances, either in triathlon or open water. What is interesting in here for me is I was, and loads of the coaches are under impression swimmers are very good with breathing because they have good lung capacity. But what we found challenging in elite swimmers too is their respiratory frequency or the volume they can actually fit in is it can be restricted, especially with asthmatic athletes. And so what we use the VO2 Master for is to actually check if when we measure lung capacity and what we see on the dry land actually translates to the water. So when we put the mask on and the swimmer is in the water where they have to breathe against the water, which is denser, we can see if they can actually breathe effectively as well. With the VO2 master, it allows us to assess standard things like VO2 on and off kinetics, which I find really useful, especially at elite level. What I tend to see, one of the most distinguishing factors in elite swimming or even in hockey players are the VO2 on and off kinetics. I use VO2 off kinetics to try to um, tell coaches or strength and conditioning coaches to optimize the recovery between the repetitions. So, for example, we often argue with coaches about utilizing fixed recovery periods between the intervals. And when we assess hockey players or even swimmers, we can then put the athletes into specific groups where people recover slower and faster. And that's probably one of the most useful areas where we can make huge training adaptations when we start individualizing and making sure the athlete is getting the right stimulus. So, for example, I used to have a problem where in swimming, for example, we like coaches would want to work on anaerobic capacity, where they would prescribe, let's say, 1050s on all-out pace with a recovery period for like 3 or 4 minutes. Could nicely see like how the swimmers with worse or slower off kinetics would struggle more and more and more. So now when I can actually assess the off kinetics path, then we can optimize even at elite level where swimmers swim together and they have to usually follow specific program. What I also find useful is where we utilize VO2 Master to combine the data with the lactate profiling. So what we tend to do is, as most of you guys probably know, we assess peak lactate, we assess clearance rate, we assess area under the curve, we assess VLA max, and at the same time, we assess the off kinetics path. And what we do tend to see is the athletes who are worse aerobically, so recover slower and they have slower off kinetics, have much greater area under the curve, and then we have to work with them to actually be able to clear the lactate from the system faster. What I find really useful is similar to what I mentioned about trying to monitor economy with swimsuit and wetsuits. I utilize the similar situation we choose. So what I tend to see in world nowadays, especially after there was a Nike project with sub 2 hour marathon project with Elliot, loads of athletes went to buying their carbon shoes. But what I noticed by testing the athletes is it doesn't necessarily mean if Elliot was using the best shoes in the world, that will translate to better economy for you. So I like at elite level, I'm trying to help athletes to find shoe that is optimal for them and for their for their body, or we are working with physiotherapists, so it's actually allowing them to reduce the oxygen cost and at the same time prevent injuries. So, and what I tend to see is depending on the athlete, the economy is different depending on the shoe. So it doesn't necessarily mean that Nike is always the best shoe or Adidas is the best shoe. And it really helps me, like VO2 Master really helps me to assess that. There are a few more case studies where you can see how I use VO2 Master. So that this is an MMA fighter who is a world champion. And what I found really useful, it allowed us to optimize how long the laps should be when they do fights or when they prepare for their fights. What we also assessed is when they put the protector inside the mouth, it completely changes their breathing mechanics. And what we see is when you put the 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 guard in, the oxygen cost at the same heart rate goes up a lot faster. So what we are trying to do now is within the training sessions when they were not used to have the guard, they train with the guard, and then we monitor within the labs when they go like 3 minutes boxing, then we're trying to optimize the recovery. Another example is with the water slalom. This young guy is a silver medalist from Olympic Games. And what we found really useful is checking on his breathing quality. So if you think about it, as you sit in the boat, what happens very often, you close your chest down, which means the lungs can't expand as much. And we have a testing scenario set up where he runs or paddles between the 15-meter gates into the like to the shape of 8, and the VO2 master sends us the data, and we can nicely see as soon as he reduces his respiratory frequency, his cost of VO2 goes down because he doesn't have to expand the chest as much, and therefore we can train him on the flood water, and we can see it nicely then translating to wild water when he goes down the river. There are a few examples where I use VO2 Master. This is an NHL player. It's a defender. I've been working with him for the last 2 years, and it's been really useful um, because what I don't know, guys, if you do know how ice hockey players train. So most of the conditioning work happens on air bikes or on bikes or running treadmills. And what I found really useful is that the testing they utilize in NHL to actually choose players to get into the team doesn't necessarily correlate with the performance you see on ice. So what I was kind of challenging with him, and also when we were talking with the managers that like always discuss with you how the summer preparation is going for those athletes, is like if you assess a hockey player on ice, they have a completely different fitness parameters and outcomes as you would assess them on Wingate test on the bike. So what we tend to do, I prepared an example here, is they do a 3-minute all-out shuttle test where they go up and down the ice every 15 meters. They change the direction by using uh, quick breaks. So you can see a profile of each turn. And what I find the most useful in here, it allows me to assess their VO2 peak, their heart rate, how they're actually ventilating. And by connecting the Moxie monitors, I can see if there are any asymmetries between the legs. So in this situation, you can see there is quite a significant asymmetry between the legs. So therefore, we can then work with the physiotherapist to actually check if there is a problem with the movement or the stiffness, or if it's the case of them being weaker on one leg than the other. What we then tend to do is we keep the Moxies on within the training sessions, and we make them to break on the weak leg. So when we monitor the Moxie, when we do the test again and profile again, we would like to see that the legs are more symmetrical. There are last two examples I would like to share with you. This has nothing to necessarily do with the performance, but what I tend to use VO2 Master for is to check resting metabolic rate. So here are the two examples where what I find interesting. So the first example is a female athlete uh, losing period and not eating optimally. So from the female triad or female athlete problems we are looking at, we use it to monitor their health. As soon as we see there is a slowing down of the metabolism. We tend to also see the blood markers and the data from like HRV from long-term perspective correlates nicely with how slow the metabolism is. From different perspective, this is a situation I see with overtrained athletes or athletes after COVID. So I didn't really pay attention to this until recently, where I had a few athletes that had COVID and they went into training too fast. And what we found when we compared them to their normal, their resting metabolic rate was much faster. And in that case, we had to adjust the nutrition for them so they can actually cope with the increased rate for basic metabolic rate. The last example, which I find really interesting and where VO2 Master helped me a lot, is to actually think about the nutrition for female athletes. We ran a few trials on female athletes where we were measuring um, resting metabolic rate within early follicular, late mid-luteal, and late luteal phase. And you can nicely see in here, like in the phase number 1, the resting metabolic rate is the lowest. And as soon as we go through phase 2 and mainly phase 3, where we have high progesterone and the temperature regulation is harder for the body, then you can see an increase in the resting metabolic rate by approximately 100 to 200 kilocalories per day. And when actually working with female athletes over the last few months, we can make sure that if they are in the phase 3, they get the extra snack. And the subjective feedback we get from athletes is they can sustain the performance and the training intensity at much higher level than when they used to be. So that's an example of how you can also utilize the resting metabolic rate from VO2 Master to help athletes to fuel appropriately, so they can actually do the sessions you design for them effectively, regardless of what is happening with the hormones. I think this is all from me. If you guys have any questions in regardless to whatever I said, I'm leaving here my email, so feel free to contact me and I will stay here by the end of the talk in case you have any questions for me.
Thank you very much, Ava. Mark, whenever you're ready, please feel free to join us.
Let me get my screen shared for you. Can you see that, Jacob?
Yep, looks good.
All righty. Well, I will get going. Just want to make sure I'm good. Once I have this up, I have my notes on one side and still can't see you guys. So, okay. Definitely appreciate the introduction, Jacob. And it's great to be here today. Um, this is just what I would say is my personal perspective of the current state for the military's use in portable and, just lab-based VO2. So for everybody on the call today, please think of this as like a 10,000 foot view, as I'm not going to get super granular when it comes down to like specific research. But I really want to kind of give an overview. And if anybody's got any questions, again, at the end, please let me know, ask questions here, send me an email. I'm perfectly fine having some conversation outside of this as well. Like Jake said, my background is in clinical health promotion. I was a health education manager when we set this up. I've now moved into a research role for the Defense Health Agency. I serve as an adjunct professor working at 2 different universities, and a lot of the courses that I teach are tactical physiology, strength conditioning, and the majority of our courses heavily focused now on the portable devices. So I think this is a great topic. Um, We also, on the side, I work with a hormone health clinic that focuses on TRT, and we use a portable. We have our VO2 Master, and we absolutely love it. And that's a primary variable that all of our patients go through to determine where they are. So Ava did a great job speaking about some of the things that you can get from this. And I've also worked with the ROTC cadets in my PhD process. That should be finalizing come soon. And I say all that to say I have to throw out a disclaimer simply because I do work with the government that this is my opinion. This is my education. This is not any kind of endorsement for the Department of War, Department of Defense, the Defense Health Agency, or any kind of government organization. This is solely just me enjoying this conversation and wanting to discuss this with y'all today. So with that, let's jump right into the opening vision, right? And I want to start by framing the intent of the presentation because it's not to talk about a singular device. It's not to talk about a single study or a single training intervention, right? Instead, this is about how we're measuring aerobic, you know, readiness and why VO2 max kind of matters in the tactical populations and where portable metabolic technology really fits within that conversation. So in tactical settings, VO2 max is often discussed as just another metric, but in reality, it's representing the convergence of the cardiovascular, your pulmonary, your muscular system, and the capacity that they all have, right? So when we look at sustained movement under load, repeated high intensity bouts, or the body's ability to recover between tasks, right? Aerobic capacity becomes a foundational limiter or enabler at that point. Right now, today we're going to talk in the first section about the significance of VO2 in tactical populations. Kind of briefly, review some of the why behind aerobic fitness and how it consistently emerges as sort of like a predictor for task performance, sometimes injury risk, but ultimately it's overall operational sustainability. Um, and I really want to highlight that this is not about redefining VO2 max. It's really about reinforcing why it remains relevant despite evolving fitness standards and testing paradigms, right? Now, from there, we're going to kind of go into the overview of current military standards and portable metabolic devices. Traditionally, VO2 measurements has been confined to laboratory-based assessments, which kind of limits the ecological validity. But the advancements in some of these portable metabolic technologies now allow us to capture some of the oxygen consumption in environments that more closely resemble the real-world military tasks that we see. And then we're going to jump into some of the research. I'll kind of bring some of that up again. I'm not getting too granular. And then I'm going to talk about some gaps and future directions that I think we should take this. And again, this is just my thoughts on it and just conversations that I've had with colleagues. And I say this despite, advances in measurement capability, there's still a disconnect between the physiological data and the applied decision making. So finally, I'm going to close with some applications and recommendations because I don't feel a good presentation, is there if I don't give you something to walk away with, followed by a brief summary. So again, this is the goal here is not to suggest any kind of sweeping changes to military policy or anything like that, but to sort of demonstrate how and where those portable devices can support more informed readiness metrics and decision making. So when we're discussing VO2 max in tactical populations, right, it's important to move beyond viewing this as a simple performance metric or endurance marker. And while it is one, VO2 max really represents, and reflects the integrated capacity, again, of the multiple systems, including cardiovascular oxygen delivery, pulmonary gas exchange, muscular oxygen utilization, and really at that mitochondrial level, right? So the integration is critical in tactical environments where tasks are prolonged, tasks are repeated, and they're rarely performed in isolation, such as like those lab-based measurements that I previously discussed. Now, service members often operate under load, under physical and psychological stress with very limited recovery. And this makes the aerobic capacity a key determinant of how quickly fatigue can accumulate and how well that performance can be sustained over time. So there's a strong body of literature that links VO2 max to low carriage tolerance, and this is back from the early 2000s. as external load increases, right, our metabolic demand rises, and individuals with higher aerobic capacity can perform the same task at a lower relative intensity. So this delays fatigue thresholds, preserves movement economy, and ultimately it supports decision making under that physical stress. And aerobic capacity also plays sort of what I like to say like a buffering role during sustained movement under these adverse conditions, right? Such as sleep deprivation in some of military operations, caloric restriction with certain populations within the military, psychological stress when they're away from their families for long periods of time, or prior exertion depending on the types of missions that they're running or training missions. Now, in these scenarios, higher VO2 allows individuals to maintain output when other physiological systems are already compromised. And I think that that's key. So, another important consideration that a lot of people want to zoom in on and like really get granular with is injury risk. And lower aerobic fitness has really been associated with higher rates of musculoskeletal injury over time. And, during high volume training and load carriage, this is usually, or I would say likely due to like earlier fatigue and degraded movement mechanics and reduced tissue tolerance, with those prolonged tasks, because sometimes load carriage can be multiple hours with very heavy loads, depending on the person in a relative sense. So ultimately, tactical relevance of VO2 to me, it extends beyond that sport performance lens that we typically look at VO2 with. So in military populations, to me, it reflects the readiness and operational sustainability. Rather than, really identifying who can perform best in isolation on a treadmill in a lab, the VO2 max, especially in portable devices, kind of gives us insight as to who can remain effective when demands are cumulative, and conditions are kind of unpredictable. So building on the why behind VO2 max and why it matters in tactical settings, here I want to highlight the role of it as a readiness marker, right, rather than again that simple performance outcome. And one of the most consistent findings in literature, and everyone will know this, is uh, the relationship between VO2 max and run performance, especially, looking at standardized military assessments like the Army Combat Fitness Test, or the Army Fitness Test Run, right? While these sort of give us like a point-based or a pass-fail outcome, that VO2 max is going to explain the physiological basis for that result. Now, if you got two service members that they may achieve the same score, one may be operating near that physiological ceiling, while the other retains substantial reserve capacity. Now, that VO2 max helps distinguish between the two readiness profiles. And, I'm glad Ava talked about profiling because this is a huge thing in the military. And it's, again, it's in performance, it's in the military as well. So the VO2 max is also strongly associated with ruck marching, right? Or load carriage operations, and the efficiency there. Because as that external load increases, metabolic demand rises. And an individual with a higher aerobic capacity can perform the same task at a lower relative intensity. Now, this is going to delay fatigue, which is exactly what we need, preserve movement economy, support sustained performance, especially again during those long load carriages. Whenever I was in the military, we would march sometimes 3, 4, 5 hours, depending on what we were doing and what kind of training we had. So you have to be able to get an individual ready for that type of event. And these are excellent devices for measuring that. Now, recovery capacity, we can look at that as well, and I think that it's very vital looking at recovery capacity under repeated stress, because it's just something we have to consider. So tactical tasks, again, they're rarely isolated, and they often occur with limited recovery. We have sleep restrictions and deprivation, calorie deficits, psychological stressors. Again, that higher VO2 max is linked to faster recovery kinetics, and allows for more restoration of the physiological homeostasis. So, because of the relationships there, VO2 max really serves as two key readiness functions. First, to me, it can be used as a screening metric to identify individuals at a greater risk, and that's what some places do, and we'll talk about that in a couple slides. And we're looking at risk for early fatigue or injury during high demand tasks. Now, secondly, it's well suited for longitudinal monitoring, so more of the research-based approaches. And this enables the practitioners to, again, track adaptations, look at detraining, look at readiness training across cycles, or even their deployments. So I guess the central takeaway here is, VO2 max adds context to, what we're doing. It doesn't replace performance testing, but it deepens the interpretation by providing more insight into physiological capacity and sustainability for the service members. Now, to sort of, understand the value of metabolic systems, I guess I really wanted to toss out, what we've done historically. And most military organizations have really relied on some like field-based proxy tests to estimate aerobic capacity per se. Um, and some of these common examples, again, you've got your Cooper 12-minute, you've got your yo-yo intermittent recovery test, and then you've got your service-specific runs where, again, this is like a pass-fail, or you've got your scaled systems. The U.S. Army has like a 2 mile run. The Marine Corps has their 3 mile run. And again, these tests, they're practical, they're scalable, they're very easy to administer, and it's very useful when you have large populations. That's exactly why they do it. Um, However, when they only provide indirect estimates, and they're often influenced by the pacing of the service member, the motivation of the individual, the terrain that they're on, even though it's supposed to be on flat ground, it's not always like that. And the environmental conditions, because sometimes you're out at a track, sometimes you're out on the roadway, sometimes it's cold, depending on where you're stationed at. And as a result of that, the ability to reflect true aerobic capacities generally considered low. So, on the opposite end of that, we've got lab-based metabolic carts where, I'm sure everybody on this call that's interested in that, has played around with them. You've got your protocols like the Bruce treadmill test, modified Bruce, and then if you buy like a top end lab-based model of like the Cosmet stuff, they have their own custom protocols that they send you for different types of runs. And that's great, and these are direct measurements of oxygen consumption, and they're very controlled conditions. Now, again, these systems offer very high validity, and they remain that gold standard for VO2 assessment. However, they're resource intensive. You have to have a large budget for it. They're very time consuming depending on the setup and where you've got to go and what you got to do with it. And they kind of limit what I would say is the ecological validity, meaning, they reflect that laboratory performance, but they don't really look at the occupational task demands of the military. So this disconnect is between, controlled testing, real world performance. This is where those portable metabolic systems kind of become relevant. And, you know, Here I kind of want to focus on what portable metabolic, devices do, as they're often, there's some confusion, when I talk to people between what the systems measure and what they influence. And again, Ava did a great job talking about all the different variables that the VO2 master can bring to the table. And I think that's awesome because they the portable devices don't enhance VO2 max, but their value really lies in the physiological like resolution that they provide outside that laboratory. Now, these systems, they allow for direct measurement for specifics like oxygen consumption. Some do carbon dioxide production, respiratory exchange ratio, respiratory quotient, ventilatory thresholds, which I use all the time. And these are, again, they're not just estimates. They're predictive equations. They're physiological measurements that are describing how energy is produced and how it's utilized during movement, right? Um, I think the inclusion of RER, RQ, and the VT1, VT2 is particularly relevant in tactical settings. Now, while VO2 max reflects that peak capacity, thresholds are going to help us identify intensity domains, shifts where fatigue begins and starts to accumulate more rapidly. So this information to me is it's critical in understanding, work rates and prolonged repeated tasks. So from a validity perspective, I'd say most modern systems, and this is looking at tons of research papers over the past few years, It usually ranges about 5 to 10% of laboratory-based metabolic carts, depending on the protocols, depending on the movement types and the modes that you're using. Again, there's no like it's a specific, standard error. You really have to get granular with, is it the exact same, mode? Is it the exact same protocol on said treadmill or on said cycle? And then you have to play around with that. And while it's not perfect, this really represents like substantial improvement over the field-based tests, while allowing the assessment to be, I would say, operationally relevant for our environments, right? Now, where these systems truly differentiate themselves is, what they enable. Again, portable devices are going to enable us to take that VO2 measurement during running, load carriage, and other kind of field-based protocols, that are more resemble those military tasks like movement under fire and stuff like that. And then when we look at like total tactical, not just the military, firefighters use this a lot as well, and we'll talk about that in a second. But this is rather than assessing that isolation. Again, I always speak in isolation when I talk about lab-based because you are isolated to that treadmill or to that cycle, and you're not getting a lot of variables that are affecting your performance like you would in the real world. So I think it's important to emphasize that, the portable systems don't replace lab testing by any means. Lab carts are always going to remain that gold standard, but I think portable systems are slowly creeping up, and I think it's a complementary tool right now that's expanding the assessment of task demands, movement economy, and the physiological strain. So presently in, I would say in the military settings, right? Portable systems are employed in, I would say, select health and performance environments rather than just, standardized enterprise capability. And some of these examples include the organization, which I somewhat oversee now, is the Armed Forces Wellness Centers. We have 37, 38 sites around the globe now that use these. We go out in the field, we do our metabolic testing, we do VO2 testing, we take it to the units and help. You got operational support teams in the Air Force. They're using these. They're going out and using it as surveillance and, getting inside the units. And now we've got our Army holistic health and fitness programs. They're bringing some of these in. And in these settings, VO2, the testing is typically conducted again by trained clinicians, performance professionals with specialized expertise, even though they're individualized devices. And with that, age and sex specific ACSM normative values. That's the classifications that we use. You can see that at the bottom of the screen there. Um, those kind of provide us with a reference context for interpretation, and we recognizing that normative values alone don't define tactical readiness, but it gives us a starting point to tell people where they are and where they can go. Now, the primary purpose of these VO2 testings, again, in these environments is assessment and screening for us, for the most part. Very few units are really going after performance enhancement right off the bat because we just need to know where people are. Again, the run times that they've always used, people typically would get out there, they would run a little bit, they'd pass their test and they'd be good. But when it came down to task specific measures, they were gassing out. And this gives us a little bit better understanding of the individual, right? So implementation, again, highly program dependent. I think that it really depends on where you are, what your unit's doing. But the problem is there's no standardized protocol, there's no standardized unified decision framework, or there's no consistent method for sort of integrating the VO2 data into training prescriptions and readiness stratification. And the uses, again, vary by services, they vary by location and the mission set, and available expertise is a big one as well. Now, as a result, VO2 data most often applied at the individual assessment for education and baseline profiling, which again is very good. The current state, I really think it highlights key limitations. Challenge really isn't technology or lack of interest, but the absence of more framework. So, and this is going to be a quick slide. I don't want to, harp too much on it, but there is some good research out there right now. One of those up there actually uses the Parvo system, but they're redoing the study and looking at it using VO2 Masters, and I think it's awesome because they wanted to get out in the field. There's some literature that shows that, we're primarily used for characterization rather than direct performance enhancement. Most studies are using these systems for VO2 max, sub max, and then we're quantifying more the metabolic costs and task specifics, such as moving at a given speed, carrying a defined load, or sustaining work over time. Now, again, the load carriage research represents major area of application right now. Portable systems allow, the direct measurement of oxygen consumption during loaded movement rather than relying on, heart rate or pace as proxies. And this has improved the understanding of how the load magnitude and speed and terrain and the individual characteristics influence that physiological strain. And I think that's awesome. Um, Portable devices are also used in occupational simulations. I think that's cool. There was some firefighter research that was great. And I think we're moving more towards this, trying to get away, into portable devices. There were some portable devices in the beginning that had some issues with Bluetooth connectivity. And as they went up some steps, they were losing connectivity. So I think we're moving more towards other devices now. And this is particularly relevant for military and our law enforcement, where performance is really defined by durability, repeatability, rather than just saying, hey, this is how great you are. You got to be able to do it over time, right? So much of the existing evidence kind of remains descriptive, cross-sectional. These studies are very valuable at validating tasks, comparing populations, and establishing those benchmarks. But right now, they rarely extend into longitudinal interventions. Um, and now, as we go into, the gaps right here, most research is using these again for accuracy and validation. Yes, that work's necessary, but it's left us with a strong, uh, physiological description, relatively little guidance on how to apply it. The majority of the studies are descriptive and cross-sectional. Like I said, they help us understand the cost of, the metabolic costs, compare the groups, but they're not showing us how to use these over time. They're not talking about training progression, readiness assessment, risk management. And I think the biggest gap is longitudinal research, which again, a lot of these portable devices just came out within the last 2 decades. So it's going to take some time for us to catch up. But I think that's something that we need to look at. Big limitation is often, VO2 max is often treated as like a singular number rather than part of an integrated system, that looks at the thresholds, the recovery dynamics. And then there are some research that's coming out. I know some of my research is looking at VO2 and how it, the interplay between heart rate variability, respiratory exchange ratio, and stuff like that. So we're going to see some cool stuff in the future. It's just taking some time to get out there. Um, and then the practical application, and this will be the last piece here, was, I really want to focus on how portable metabolic devices can be used in the a responsible way. Let's say it that way, for unit readiness. Now, and this is typically when we have embedded clinical health promotion or performance support structures, right? So here, the VO2 testing is, again, it's not meant to replace fitness assessments or command directed standards, but it needs to be a support tool. Within our environments like wellness centers, embedded H2Fs, and OST teams, we can use this for screening and profiling, determining those that are at risk. And I think that's exactly what we need to do. We need to look at, individuals who are operating close to their physiological limits, tracking changes over time, documenting changes over time. And from a readiness standpoint, this shifts the focus from outcomes alone to their capacity. And I think that's the biggest thing. Um, Rather than, really asking, whether someone meets a standard, we can better understand how sustainably they meet the standard and how much reserve they have under load or under that repeated stress. And I think that that's going to be a little bit more valuable than saying, yes, someone passed. But it's like, yes, they passed, but how many times can they do the exact same thing day after day in a deployed setting if, stuff hits the fan? So I think portable VO2 testing is also utilized for individual training, load progression, and then, that just comes down to how you're training an individual. So ultimately, portable metabolic devices improve readiness, hands down. They improve it by just, by helping improve decision making, but we're not adding new requirements. And when used appropriately, they help align clinical insight, performance training, operational demands to support both the individual service member and overall unit readiness for military. And in summary, I want to say, the VO2 max remains that foundational marker of aerobic capacity. Second, portable metabolic devices have expanded how and where we can, really hit that VO2. And finally, it's critical to me to emphasize that portable metabolic technology is a decision support tool, not a training intervention. These devices, they don't create fitness, they reveal physiological demand, their capacity in ways that support smarter training, better load management, and ultimately a more precise readiness measurement. So when used appropriately, I think, they strengthen and they bridge the gap between research, practice, and the operational decision making. So, and that's really where their value lies. So that's all I have today. If there's any questions, please reach out, and I'll be glad to have a chat with you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Stay on, and I'll call Ava back on to do a brief Q&A session. And so thank you everyone who, sorry. Thank you everyone who submitted questions. We had quite a few, and we only have a little bit of time to get to them. As both speakers said before, if we don't get to your question today, please feel free to reach out to them directly. So let's begin. So first, Ava, I'll begin with you. So our first question, as I work with swimmers, it's interesting how you perform the VO2 test. My question is what test you consider better suited for swimming athletes, a VO2 test or the lactate threshold?
I think it really depends. It depends on who you work with. It depends on if you're working with sprinters, mid-distance, or long-distance swimmers. I try to combine both if we have access to lactate testing and VO2. Usually the procedure we follow in most cases is to do a quick stat test to assess aerobic efficiency. So we just lift the pace up by maybe 4 to 5 seconds per 200 meters. And then we take lactate, but usually to assess lactate threshold, so anaerobic threshold, we go through the procedure of 3-minute all out test. So you start all out, you exhaust your anaerobic capacity, and the leveling of speed is a marker of your anaerobic threshold, which we then validate by having the swimmers to swim a couple 200s at that pace, and we get the VO2. So there is not just black and white VO2 and lactate threshold. What I find useful is always combine lactate kinetics with VO2 kinetics, because it doesn't necessarily mean if someone's, let's say, lactate threshold standard measure coaches tend to use is 4 millimoles. Like even in America, which is quite developed swimming country, I come across with coaches who tend to use 4 millimole as a marker of the second threshold. But when you actually take the VO2, you see the VO2 continues to rise in some situations with especially endurance athletes. So I would say there are multiple tests, and I would always combine both. And like from a resource perspective, if I can say, like what I tend to see is the cost of how much you spend on lactate analyzer and all the strips and the pricks you have to purchase all the time to assess big swimming club. I think if you can get VO2 analyzer, it kind of supports that, or it can, I hope so, when we bring in CO2 sensor, that's going to allow us to assess things without actually using the lactate.
Thank you for the context, Ava. I appreciate that. Another question for you, Ava. The question and commenter said, Ava, beautiful breath by breath data and kinetics profile. This was really impressive. What typically is your day-to-day test / retest reliability for your resting metabolic rate measurements?
So I did in-house test retest with some of the athletes I work with. When I control well for previous 2 to 3 days of training, for example, when the conditions are the same, I will get 5 to 6% coefficient of variation. So that's pretty decent for me. but as soon as I noticed, as soon as with female athletes, we coming into phase 3, where the progesterone is at its highest, or if the previous day or two you have very hard session, especially in the gym, then the resting metabolic rate is less reliable, because you can clearly see the body needs to like upgrade the energy intake, because it's trying to work at higher rate. So I don't know if it interferes with reliability, but it's actually showing us, right, that something is going on with the repair process, adaptation processes, and maybe hormonal processes that then affect um, the resting metabolic rate. But you can see nicely on my last slide, if I can share the last slide here. Can you see it?
It's coming up.
Yeah, so
Yep,
you
here
can
we go.
see, like, we repeated the resting metabolic rate in this athlete over 2 consecutive menstrual cycles. So you can see on the same day, on the same day, the following 2 cycles, the in the first testing it's 1482, and the following month is 1495. So it's not too big difference, right? Taking it at the same time in the same phase.
Thank you for the background, Ava. Makes sense. The next question I have is actually for Mark. Um, so it's, hi, Dr. Jones. A quick question about tactical testing. Do you or are there protocols? Do you know if there are protocols that simulate real stress and real combat stress, as this may impact an athlete's ability to perform and breathe or deliver and utilize oxygen properly?
So I found a couple. It wasn't in military populations. And I actually participated in one back this last October, where what we did was we were working with law enforcement officers, and the protocol was basically on a rower. We had an individual go, I think it was 500-meter row. After that, we started doing some breath work. The premise of that was breath work and HRV recovery, but the protocol was individual goes out, shoots, they qualify on the range, they step back, they do a 500-meter row, and then they go right back into a shoot. And then they compare the two different shoots. Now that's about as tactical as it gets. That's about as real world as it gets, because we were looking at decision making, the quickness to decision making, because there was a screen that lets you know if you shoot or don't shoot. And it was blue green. So as soon as it came up, they had to extend and shoot, and they had less than 2 seconds or less than a second to make a decision if they were going to shoot or not. So they looked at decision time, they looked at the breathing, and they were really determining at what types of breath work was helping them after the VO2. But that right there came directly from another study. I can't quote it off the top of my head. Again, send me an email. The grad student that I was working with at Georgia Southern University could give me the exact reference for that, and then I'll get that over to you. And then there are some, I would say, real world tactical, but it comes down to it really comes down to like the firefighting. There's some of those, and again, that's more they're going up and down steps. They're racing up to the top. They're doing drags when it comes to some of the hoses. They're putting individuals on their back and they're doing carries with them. And the only thing that I can really think about in the military world would be a ruck march. So Danielle Arcidiacono and David Looney out of USAREAM up in Natick, Massachusetts, they have a study where they looked at different load carriage weights, and they have a protocol that takes an individual outside. I believed in their study, and you guys don't kick my butt for this, but they were using a Cosmec K5, and they were looking at fuel utilization. So they're looking at RER, and how some of that shifted as you know when they went from 22% load, 44% load, 66% of their body weight load. As they were carrying that, but they do have the Ruck March protocol laid out for you. So that's a really good study. Again, it's Danielle Arcidiacono, and it was a 2023 study. Off the top of my head, I can't think about it, but shoot me an email and I can get all that over to you. Over.
Thanks, Mark. And another question for you in that same vein. So, in military settings where rapid recovery is critical, do you find the VO2 off kinetics and recovery efficiency to be more informative than the actual VO2 max figure for predicting whether a warfighter can, tactically perform?
I think VO2 max provides that, moderate predictive power, I guess you could say, and fatigability. I don't want to put like a specific number on the variance that it would have. Um, I think it's a lot better in endurance-based things rather than like high intensity or real world specifics right now, because again, there's just not enough research out there. But I do think that the influence on fatigability, is very indirect, and I think reflecting like on baseline aerobic capacity rather than fatigue resistance, it would just be better for using predictive thresholds or body composition recovery metrics. I think that's a great question. It's hard for me to answer it because I would like to know a little bit more about where we're talking about some of these off kinetics and recovery efficiency, especially. And when you say recovery efficiency, I'm thinking heart rate variability, or heart rate recovery. How quickly can we get somebody's heart rate recovery down after a strenuous engagement? But again, shoot that to me. I think that's a great question. I think that would require a little bit more ongoing conversation. But excellent question, though. That's great.
Thanks, Mark. And Ava, if you want to come back, I have a question. Actually, this would be for both of you. Are there any studies or data validating the VO2 Master platform against other metabolic carts or testing devices?
I think I found them listed on the VO2 Master
Yep,
website. I
they do
can't
have them
remember
on
the
there.
exact names, but yes.
It's 2018 Montoy and colleagues. That's a good one. And then there's another one. I can't remember off the top of my head what the other one is. Again, I've got both of the papers in a folder on my computer. I can send them out if someone would like that. But the Montoy, Montoye and colleagues, that was a really good one. And I use that for all the studies that I've done because it's the best validation paper out there. And I believe it compared against two other devices.
Thank you for that. Um, Question for you, Ava. Could you detail how frequent dysfunctional, irregular breathing patterns appear in athletes, and whether those irregular or dysfunctional breathing patterns kind of can predict oxygen use and metabolic power?
Okay, 1 second. I'm just going to have to read the question again. Thanks for. So I tend to see more dysfunctional breathing in swimmers, which is paradox. But what is the question? I do use SMO2, but I don't necessarily see a relationship between how badly they breathe and SMO2. But what I've noticed now, I use they called EO paddles. It's a power meter you put on the hand, and what we tend to see is the worse athletes breathe, the worse the hand path of the swimmer is, if that makes sense. Because they almost like if you don't expand the chest and the lungs don't fill up with the air, then the position of your body in the water is lower. Therefore, you create more drag, and therefore you can extend the arm and take the hand through the water as the coach would like, if that makes sense. I'm not sure, but there is a nice correlation based on what I see from the athletes when we use parameter and we have it on both hands, and then we correct for the breathing technique and we do some activation before they jump to the water. We can see the parameters are much better.
Oh, thank you for that, Ava. And then a final question, because I know we are pretty far over time, regarding comments on VO2 recovery kinetics that you both have made. Would either of you be able to provide an example on how EPOC or recovery mean response time would be used to adjust rest intervals between high intensity bouts of activity? And is there a rule of thumb that is used, like 2 times mean response time?
So I can tell you an example. I actually ran a session at Florida here yesterday when we were measuring the VO2 of kinetics between each 50-meter all-out effort the swimmers were doing. And what we could see, like even with the adjustment of recovery kinetics you take after one all-out effort, let's say it takes one swimmer to get down the VO2 in 4 minutes, right? It seems to be the case for like next 3 or 5 50s. But as the metabolic efficiency is getting worse, the VO2 of kinetics we measured with the VO2 master could nicely see that we have to extend the recovery period in the following 50s. So we get the athlete back on track with hitting the all out effort and the consistent times, if that makes sense. So we call it like you don't want all out sessions that are supposed to increase speed or anaerobic capacity to become a hybrid session where in the last 250s you can't sustain the time and you are almost like flipping into aerobic stimulus, if that makes sense. So that's where I find it really useful, where you can work on individual basis with a client or with an athlete is nice to see. And at the same time, if you repeat that over like repeated all out efforts, you can then also say in, I don't know, 4 or 5 weeks' time, if their recovery process is improved by you implementing the individualized programming.
And Mark, anything to add?
No, I think that was a great answer, and I don't want to detract and move to a different, aim there because a lot of the work that I've done really focuses on HRV, focuses on heart rate recovery, and not so much what Ava was discussing there and repeated bouts because mine is it's very cross-sectional. We're not doing a lot of time trials and stuff like that and going right back into exercise. So I don't even want to try to muddy the waters there. I think that was a great response.
All right. No, perfect. And so, yeah, that's all the time that we have for today. I want to thank Mark and Ava for joining us and for giving us some really neat insights into the use of portable metabolic measurement tools. And I want to thank our sponsor, VO2 Master, for all of their great work in supporting our mission to advance exercise physiology and human health. And lastly, I want to thank all the attendees. We had a enormous amount of questions and engagement, and it was a great session. So thank you all for joining us. There's a brief survey when you exit that we will ask you to complete just to get an idea of your experience today and what other exercise physiology topics you want to see us cover in the future. That being said, thank you again and have a wonderful day. Take care.